December 13th, 1990, Dallas, Texas. In a remote residential neighbourhood called Oak Cliffs, a grim discovery was made. A resident phoned police to inform them that he'd come across the naked body of a deceased female who had been shot in the head. Traumatised and in the heat of the moment, he retrieved a bedsheet and covered up the woman's lifeless body before anyone else stepped foot outside their homes. When investigators arrived, they inspected the woman's body. No identification lay in sight, and the woman had indeed been shot in the head. From close range it appeared. The woman had been posed by her killer, exposed in a humiliating way for all crime scene responders to see, and she'd been killed elsewhere and dumped brazenly in the late night or early morning hours. Within a short space of time, a name was put to her face. She was Mary Pratt, a local woman who worked the streets. Mary was only 33 years old. She was described as respectful and kind-spirited. She'd been told to leave the street life alone only the day prior to her murder. Unfortunately, she'd not had time to change her life and had fallen prey to the Dallas street lifestyle, which at that time, like other major US cities, was experiencing a crime wave and rampant styles of murder and mayhem. With little forensic evidence and no distinguishable motive for her murder, Mary was added to an increasingly growing number of unsolved murders in Dallas, and to everyone involved with working her case, it would seem like her sex work occupation just made her case more challenging to solve. However, one detail picked up on during her autopsy would provide major insight into the mind of her killer, a killer who had an obsession with eyes. Autopsy underway, the examiner recorded Mary's cause of death as a single .44 caliber gunshot wound to the head. The killer had swiftly dispatched Mary, and the next detail would prove a game changer. The medical examiner inspected Mary's face. Her eyelids were closed. She lifted Mary's eyelids and jumped back, shocked by what she had seen. Mary's eyes were missing, and the trajectory of the singular bullet couldn't explain the lack of eyes. What was going on? On even further inspection, the medical examiner realised that the killer had surgically removed Mary's eyes, probably to treasure them as some sort of sick souvenir from the crime. He'd been precise and careful, and thankfully, Mary was already deceased when he committed this heinous act. It was around this same time that a fellow working girl and friend of Mary's named Veronica Rodriguez came forward with a chilling story to tell. Veronica told police that she and Mary had been picked up by a John who took them to a remote field in South Dallas. Veronica was a heavy substance user, had been using on the day, which turned out to have been the same day that Mary was believed to have been killed. Veronica went on to say that the John became violent, pulled a gun, and she had seen Mary get shot. Veronica ran for her life and managed to escape the situation, barely avoiding death. Police listened to Veronica's story, but her previous interactions with police made her bold claim and story sound way too far-fetched. Even though Veronica confirmed two major details, the cause of death and different place of death, her substance abuse history, lack of recollection of some of the event, and made up stories from her past, made police sceptical. Mary's case went cold. Unsurprisingly, the year would end with no new information on Mary's case. It wasn't until a second body turned up in February of 1991 that police realised that they had a second connected victim. Susan Peterson, aged 27, was an outgoing and social woman. Susan was working the streets and had developed a fearsome reputation amongst the other girls and also with the police. She was no nonsense, and her brutal demise highlighted the danger that the girls working the streets of Dallas were in at the time. Despite often being standoffish with police, Susan had grown fond of officers who patrolled the streets in which she operated. She had told them that she was now clean from the gear and was scheduled to be getting married soon. Tragically, this was never to be the case, as her body was lifted from a field only 8 blocks from the previous crime scene. Once again, the medical examiner recorded the cause of death as homicide, and Susan's eyeballs were also missing. Given the unusual case and 2 confirmed victims of the same guy, the FBI was made aware of the cases and was brought in to give an offender profile. They believed that the offender was a local man and had taken the women's lives quickly, as he was now much more interested in achieving the victims' eyeballs rather than slowly killing them for his own gratification. The taking of the eyeballs was unheard of in any other murder case, and he did it surgically, risking apprehension just by being in the vicinity of the women's bodies. And he had been at risk of someone having heard gunshots nearby. The offender was arrogant and would continue killing women. 1 month following Susan's murder, and police had little information to go on. As they operated undercover, posing as working girls and Johns, they gained very little leads. Veronica Rodriguez, the same woman associated with Mary, would come up once again. Veronica had been picked up by police alongside a man nicknamed Speedy. Speedy was a John and gave police his driver's licence. The licence had an address in Oak Cliff, and police took note of the address, keeping it for safekeeping. Speedy was free, despite having been literally caught with his pants down. A call to police would lead to the discovery of a third victim of the same killer during that same month. Once again, a body of a naked female turned up, posed for everyone to see. This time the body belonged to Shirley Williams. Shirley had a day job as a housekeeper, but worked the streets at night time. Her close-knit family had no idea that she'd been selling herself on the streets, and were devastated. Shirley had last been seen wearing a yellow raincoat, hopping into a John's ride. She was never heard from again. The crime scene was similar to Mary's in that Shirley had been left in the street. One difference existed in Shirley's case though. Shirley's murder had seemingly been rushed by her killer. She had defensive wounds and had put up a fight with her killer. Hair and pubic hairs belonging to her killer were found in her hands and on her neck. But the worst piece of evidence was found on her cheek. An X-Acto blade was found embedded just above her cheek. This confirmed what investigators had known all along. This guy had used the blade to remove the victim's eyeballs. Shirley's case quickly went dry, but investigators ramped up their efforts to capture the killer. They worked long hours, pacing the streets and interacting with working girls and the local community. Everyone wanted the killer put away, and another near-miss encounter had the police on a path toward justice. A woman had encountered a John who pulled a gun on her and began yelling about how he wanted to kill all of the working girls in the neighbourhood. He was an older white male with a muscular build, and knowing the outcome that she was to be faced with, the woman did the smart thing and maced the guy before running from his vehicle. She had given the description of the man, and since he was likely a local man, police scoured pre-existing records from their earlier inquiries. They looked at the property address given by the man nicknamed Speedy and learned that the home belonged to Frederick Albright. He rented the house to Speedy, and this was the start. However, it turned out that Frederick Albright was actually deceased. He had died in the 1980s. The house actually belonged to his son, Charles Albright, aged 57. Charles had inherited the home and had actually been a lifelong Oak Cliffs resident ever since his adoption by Fred and Dell Albright in the 1930s. Police learned that Charles was a convicted felon and had charges stemming from being involved in the burglary ring and fraud-related charges. Police showed his picture to the woman who'd nearly been shot by him. She confirmed that it was the same guy. Charles Albright was now their prime suspect. With Albright now their prime suspect, new information surfaced about the man, who many saw as harmless, the perfect gentleman even. Charles was a part-time newspaper delivery man for the Dallas Times-Herald, and was able to fluently speak Spanish and French. Having previously worked as a science teacher for much of his life, he'd been popular amongst those around him throughout his entire life. Investigators learned that Charles Albright had a fascination with eyes, and according to his former partner, he'd been violent and abusive in their relationship, a seeming completely different person to what was being said about him by his friends at the softball team that he was a part of. This fascination with human eyes, and eyes in general, had begun in his childhood. His adopted mother Dell would have the biggest impact on his future behaviour, because of her introducing Charles to taxidermy, one of his biggest hobbies throughout his entire life. Dell was very reluctant to spend money on the marble eyes for Charles's increasingly growing taxidermy collection. Instead, Charles was limited to button eyes for his birds and other small animals. Growing up, Dell had been overprotective of him, and she had gone to extremes when raising him. Charles was constantly monitored and disciplined in typical and untypical ways. Some of these being him being locked in a pitch black room, him being spanked when he didn't drink his goat's milk, Charles being made to dress in girls' clothing and being tied to his bed at night, Charles being changed by Dell multiple times a day because of fears that he'd developed polio, In fact, he was actually taken to see the polio patients at the hospital one time to see how he might end up. Safe to say that these strange parenting actions by Dell marked the beginning of interests, behaviours and fantasies that caused 3 innocent women to lose their lives. But despite this parenting style being seen as a little odd by those in Oak Cliffs, Charles loved his mum. She had given him a better life and only wanted the best for him. He could have ended up being trapped in the care system after all. Charles Albright's front door was kicked in shortly following the positive confirmation of him being the suspect encountered by one of the working women. He was escorted out of his home and taken into custody whilst investigators gathered evidence from his home. They found a treasure trove of circumstantial evidence, some of the main evidence being books on science and serial killers like Anne Rule's book on Ted Bundy, a book on Edmund Kemper, and they even found masks, like something out of the BTK case. More disturbing evidence came in the form of photographs of women's faces, up close to capture their eyes. All around the house there were X-Acto knives and blades, and police knew that this was their killer, but they couldn't find any concrete evidence or the victim's eyeballs. Charles had a storage unit and that was searched, yet again there was nothing solid tying him to the murders, only preserved animals stored in jars. As the investigation began rapidly developing following Charles being labelled as the main suspect, more working girls came forward to tell police that he was a regular John of theirs. He paid extra money to beat some of the women with a rope just to hear them scream, and sometimes he even asked for the girls to spank him, as if he was reliving his childhood. Albright often took girls to a field, and upon searching a field close to where Shirley had last been seen near to, her yellow raincoat was found in a bunch of sticks and rubbish. Shirley's raincoat was sent for examination and hairs found matched to a squirrel tail. This squirrel tail hair matched to Albright's vacuum cleaner, and that's probably the first time in history that that's ever happened. Head hairs belonging to Shirley were also found in the vacuum. Given that most evidence from the 3 murders came in the Shirley Williams case, everyone involved felt it best to try him only for that murder. Charles Albright was ultimately given a life sentence for Shirley's murder. Realistically, everyone knows that he killed the other 2 women. Albright landed in the Texan prison system and spent his time doing woodworking, and he even coached the prison softball team at one point. Thankfully he's off the streets, and there's no taxidermy in the Texan prison system. Rest in peace to Mary, Susan and Shirley. And just a side note, what I could find about this case, they never recovered the 3 victims' eyes. This has been the case of Charles Albright. As always, thank you for watching.